stories. The first story, as we already mentioned, was the National Guard deployment on January 6th,
right,
or the lack of deployment. The second story that we worked together on was what is not happening in Western North Carolina after what a FEMA official told me was the worst disaster he had ever seen times 10.
right.
Yet we were looking at a micro fraction of the military deployment to assist them than any of these other lesser disasters that he was referring to. So let's go ahead and start with January 6th, because
Sure.
obviously you were there at the time. You were Assistant Secretary of the Army at the time, and something was happening at the Capitol, and you get a phone call.
Right.
Take it from there.
Right. If I could be just a little lengthy in getting there, January 6th to me was a continuation of a whole bunch of things that finally reached a head on January 6th with regard to the Department of the Army. The Army has a very large National Guard. One of the elements of that is in Washington, D.C. It's a funny kind of guard because there's no governor. And so its chain of command actually originates with the President of the United States. The President appoints the commander of the Guard. In this case, it was General Walker. I believe he's been a DEA agent, so he wasn't really like a lifelong general officer in the Army. And then he pins on the 2-star rank and wears the uniform of a general officer and commands the D.C. Guard. That chain of command can go straight to the President, but normally it's President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army, and then General Walker. So I had a couple occasions to go visit with him. And they were really precipitated by the riots, the Floyd event in Minneapolis, and then what we saw around our country. And of course, the Army became intimately, interested in that because the Army Guard. The Guard may be called on, and then you saw places like, in the case of the Rodney King riots in L.A., and the President can issue a proclamation, cease and desist, go from whence you came, end your disturbance. And then following that, he can federalize the Guard or send in the active Army. And it's been a mix over the years.
This is a very interesting phrase, the Insurrection Act,
yes,
which is not known by most people what that really means. And for a lot of people, the first time that they ever heard about it was related to January 6th,
yep,
because Oath Keepers founder and leader Stuart Rhodes had written a couple of open letters to President Trump asking him to invoke the Insurrection Act, right, that day to overturn what he believed was a fraudulent, right, election. But you weren't so much concerned about that, were you?
Absolutely not. I'd seen President Trump up close and personal at the White House at Army-related events. Mm-hmm. We're lucky to have had him and to have him again. He's a stand-up guy with obviously more guts than most of us have. But anyway, the Insurrection Act became the boogeyman. I don't know if it came out of Time magazine, which later published this story about how they were going to overturn the election no matter what. Right, and how they had it all wired, and they were going to sponsor some sort of an insurrection and run off Trump as some kind of a coup leader. But clearly, what was going on in America was unprecedented in its scope, and frankly, it shocked the Army because we're a very diverse set of people, right? And the Army was looking around at itself. We had just decided to remove photos from officer promotion files, which sounds like, who cares? Right, and until you hear the Navy after we do that, tell the Secretary of Defense, well, it was hard for us to figure out how to promote minorities without the photos. Okay, that tells you everything that was wrong with the photos.
Right.
Right, it's a meritocracy. America has one chance to blow it in a major war, and then it's over. We need the best people. And so we began doing things that clearly could lead to systemic disadvantaging of people, right? Mm-hmm. Photos might be one of those things. So we get them out of there, right? If you're not a handsome guy or a handsome lady, maybe you don't get picked, right? So it's not just a matter of complexion, but it might be looks. Oh, this guy's a little heavy, right? That guy is a little skinny. He doesn't look like a general. And really that went on. And so we got rid of these things. And that was the first step in making sure we were squared away on, do we have a level playing field? Do we have opportunity? Against that backdrop, Congress in 2020 had passed the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, and in Section 529, directed the Department of Defense to have a diversity and inclusion plan. So all the services had to have one. And so that was in our forefront of things we needed to make sure we got done by law. And now we want to make sure, are we creating a level playing field for people? Then came a memo from West Point. I'm a West Point graduate. I've got kids in my family who went to West Point. I love the place. And I think it's a fundamental institution. But here comes this memo, and I read it, 10, 20, 30 times. I could not believe what I was reading. And finally, I just called it the West Point Manifesto. And I couldn't have believed it could happen, because first, when I got appointed as Assistant Secretary, I took a trip to West Point to find out about Cadet Rapone. He had graduated from West Point, and on graduation day, opened his blazer and showed America Che Guevara, and in his hat, Marxism stuff. And it's like, it's a 4-year deal. It's immersive. You got roommates, you got coaches, you got everybody. How could you not know this guy was in the ranks?
Right.
And here we are now. The West Point Manifesto is written by the first black female first captain at West Point, with the hockey team captain, I think, Rhodes Scholars, the top of the class. West Point systemically racist. The dean and the commandant must confess that white supremacy is white privilege is how they got their positions. And then it went on to deride their classmates. Now, these characters are off at Harvard or Princeton or, in England in school getting their master's degree without serving a lick in the field army. And they're deriding their classmates who are redneck, gun-toting, sort of Neanderthals.
Right.
I was furious. And so I found out about critical race theory that day. I'd never heard of it. And I started doing my homework and dug into it. And then I went up to see the Secretary of the Army, and he was in with the Chief of Staff. And they looked like they'd been kicked to hell. And I said, "You've just read this memo, right?" And I go, "Yeah." And I said, "We're not calling in academics, and we're not calling in consultants. This is an Army problem. I'm going to West Point. We're going to figure out what's going on." So that was the backdrop. All this was going on. And it got sort of more and more ridiculous.